My name is Stephen Flood and I'm going to look at some of the economic impacts of climate change in Ireland. I'd like to start by looking at impacts in the developed world and developing worlds. Then I'm going to look at some global figures, around cost figures around economic impacts, look at my own work, and then finish up with some of the limitations of economic impacts, economic assessments in this area. So agriculture in Ireland, globally agriculture is a very important sector in terms of climate change impacts. But economic studies in Ireland actually show that impacts will be negligible with a medium warming scenario, but with a stronger warming scenario of up to 4 degrees by the end of the century, there will actually be positive benefits from warming, according to economic literature out there. Inland flooding is a huge area of cost in Ireland for economic cost in Ireland, with stream flow set to increase by 20% by the middle of the century. Also, 50-year flood events, present 50-year flood events turning more towards 10-year flood events, return periods. The economic cost of the 2009 winter floods of 244 million, over 8,500 insurance claims. Sea level rise, as Sylvia mentioned earlier, is another significant area of impact in Ireland economically, climate change. Impacts here, sea level rise, impacts of half a metre up to 7 metres by the end of the century. With combined sea level rise with storm surge incidents on around Irish coasts, you're looking at erosion and degradation of wetlands and impacts on vulnerable buildings and infrastructure. In the developing world, globally looking at a loss of about 11% of natural areas by 2050. Desertification is a huge issue. A case study, especially in the Sahel region of Northern Africa. It's a 1,000-kilometre wide strip that stretches across Northern Africa with a huge amount of millions of people relying on it for their livelihoods in agriculture, and that's rapidly being sucked up by the Sahara north of it. Glaciers provide a huge amount of water supply for most of the developing world, especially in the drier parts of the year, and with the glacial retreat that's occurring, there's some real danger that there's going to be huge impacts in terms of global developing populations. Looking at figures around the creation of around 200 million climate refugees in this century, which are very startling, scary figures. Looking at the economic figures, impacts of impacts of 1.5 to 10% in terms of global GDP, which is 645 billion or 645,000 million euros. The 10% scale, 4.8 trillion, so there's a huge range of impact costs. But if you look over at the adaptation costs, you see that Stern estimates them at 3 to 27 billion, 1,000 million euros for developing countries, and the latest report from the World Bank, 56 to 74 billion a year for the global economy. So while there's a huge range of valuations given here, it's clear that the adaptation costs are significantly less than impact costs. Okay, so some of my work, I've looked at inland flooding, I've looked at property impacts, and coastal flooding, I've looked at property impacts and wetland impacts. Impact costs in Ireland are estimated in around 4.8 billion, 1,000 million euros. Adaptation costs have just jumped out of the box, they're 80 to 800 million euros. So again, you see the rationale of acting early for adaptation rather than waiting to see. Now, this is leads on to the final slide, looking at limitations of the economic approach. A lot of the economic literature makes the argument that future generations are going to be wealthier than present generations. So it makes sense to hold off and not to react, not to put money towards adaptation or mitigation until you get closer into the future time scenarios, which is the economic rationale for a lot of these impact studies that I showed on the last slide, or the slide before that. But there's a couple of real difficulties around this approach. The first one being that it doesn't account for the non-substitutable characteristics of non-market goods. So you can't simply replace a species once it becomes extinct, or replace a rainforest once it's chopped down. It also doesn't, they often don't take into account tipping points in the climate system where you're going to have potentially irreversible climate or runaway climate change impacts. So you need to factor these in and not act now rather than wait and see what happens. Also, in these models as well, it often doesn't take account of those in the developing world and their plight, just because simply economically they don't have as much of an impact as the rest of the world. So it's something that needs to be addressed in the economic modelling world in this area. That's it. Thank you.